Good afternoon. My name is Brian Reif, and welcome to today's Activity Strong webinar, The Truth About the Current State of Employee Wellbeing and What Leaders can do about it. For today's webinar, we are providing one free NAB, NCAP, NCCDP, NCTRC, and NSZRTD CEU credits. To be eligible for the CEU credits, you need to remain on the webinar for the full hour. At the end of the webinar, I will provide the required post-webinar CEU survey evaluation link in the webinar chat room box. It will also be sent to your email this afternoon. Please make sure that you check your junk and spam folder for this link. The survey must be completed by midnight Eastern Standard Time this Thursday. If you have any questions, please email us at webinars@linksenior.com. And just a reminder that the CEU certificates will be issued by email before the end of the day on Friday. Also, make sure that you check your junk and spam folder for the CEU certificate. I'm going to turn it over to Charles now.
Thank you so much, Brian. Hey, Gene, it's great to have you. I'm so excited. Welcome, everyone. My name is Charles de Vilmorin, and I'm very excited for us to be all together for our October 1st Activity Strong webinar. We're going to talk in a few minutes about the truth about the current state of employee well-being and what leaders can do about it. Before we get started, a little bit of background. Activity Strong was started in partnership with Activity Connection, NAP, and NCAP, and led by Link Senior. And before we get into the next slides about the background of all that, just a quick reminder, which is that, as you probably noticed, the chat gets very, very busy, which is a great thing. But make sure you select the everyone drop down to make sure that everyone sees your contribution. And also, just a quick heads up, our wonderful speaker today has been nice and very willing to build in a lot of interactions. So make sure that you're ready to interact with the polling feature and Slido, and we'll share all the details in a few minutes. The background quickly. Oh, sorry. The background quickly about Link Senior, which is now part of LifeLoop, is it's a company that I started about 17 years ago, and we were very excited to announce the merger with LifeLoop in July. And so the idea is to bring like the best of resident engagement technology. The whole idea of both companies is to help senior living do what it loves to do, which is to engage residents with purpose. So we're very passionate about elevating the experience, very passionate about making sure that every resident gets daily person-directed, person-centered, and therapeutic engagement. So that's where the experience of both LifeLoop and now Link Senior is joining force. And obviously, we're very excited to continue working together. So for the quick introduction for Gene, I would say that I would just want to thank you, Gene, for your patience, because we were set to speak, I think, back in April, and we had a little bit of a weather predicament, I would say. And so thank you for coming back. The background on why we believe this topic is so important is obviously it's in the roots, it's in the DNA of LifeLoop and in the DNA of Activity Strong to help elevate the experience of our residents, and obviously through resident engagement and all. But if you think about these touch points of the industry and the residents, how can we make these touch points as best as possible, sometimes magical? And the answer is obviously the teams. All of our teams, including you, that gracefully and wittingly show up at work. Well, that care force is so important, because without that, obviously nothing happens. And that's where, we're excited to have Gene, because not only Gene obviously is a well-known national speaker on the topic, but she's also a true unique individual where she has operating experience and a lot of other types of experience to talk about the topic itself. These are the learning objectives. And with that, Gene, I'll let you start your presentation, start sharing your screen. And I want to thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Charles. Brian and Emily, I want to thank you too. So I get this all fired up so we can start talking about the nuts and bolts of our topic today. Bear with me just a moment as I get to the correct slide. So yes, so good afternoon, everyone. As Charles said, my name is Jean Hartnett, and I have been in the senior living profession for decades now. I started on the front line of care in the late 1980s as a certified nursing assistant. And I'm really going to be sharing with you kind of my growth and development as a leader in our profession, and how moving away from the senior living community and going to the opposite end of the continuum into pediatrics really informed the work that I'm doing now in senior living. So as Charles mentioned, I consider myself an expert. It's always a little bit strange to kind of give yourself that moniker. But what I can tell you is that when I started in the senior living profession in 1989, I literally fell in love with everything that we do in senior living from a frontline caretaker's standpoint. So the bathing, the dressing, the toileting, the transferring, the feeding, kind of all of those unsavory tasks we think about when we think about our certified nursing assistants, I absolutely fell in love with. And it was these very early experiences that led me to get my master's degree and study health services administration so that I could come back to the nursing home environment and be an executive director, an administrator, and eventually a chief operating officer. It's important for this audience to know that my most recent tour of duty as a caregiver was that as a family caregiver. My mother had a stroke in 2021, and since she was my father's caregiver, they didn't really have anyone to manage both of their illnesses. So I left my job where I was currently working in pediatrics and moved home and took care of them until they both passed away in 2022, just a couple months apart. And I share that with you because I want to demonstrate that I have seen caretaking and caregiving from all different angles. And I've been in all different types of settings, whether it's skilled nursing, assisted living, or memory care neighborhoods that I have managed. And what I have found over my career is that there is one topic that unites all levels of care and all roles in a nursing home and assisted living. And that topic is mental health and trauma. So when I went to Children's Hospital and Medical Center after I left the senior living environments that I was working in, it was there that I learned about childhood trauma. And specifically, I learned about the ACEs assessment. And the ACEs assessment stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it is a survey and an assessment that my team at Children's did with all of our children's and families. And I'm really going to get into the nuts and bolts of the ACEs assessment, but I wanted you all to know and have an appreciation that I started out in the geriatric field as a young woman, left it and went to pediatrics, and now I am back applying what I learned in the pediatric field to what we do in geriatrics. And hopefully you will find in a very powerful way. So I like to begin my presentations by saying this quote from Maya Angelou. And she says that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. I believe that many of us on this call today have an untold story inside of us. And many of those stories have their origins in the trauma we experienced as young people, as young adults, or as adults. Part of our discussion today is talking about why our stories of past trauma stay hidden from people in our families, from our spouses, from our children, from our best friend that we met at church. And of course, we keep these stories hidden from our coworkers. And I'm going to talk about why keeping these stories secret, what that does to us internally. So before we dive into the lecture part of it, I've got to do a little activity. So I've got to have Brian share his screen next because I'm going to be asking you a question. And it's that time where Charles cued us to pull out your phones, and you're going to be hitting a QR code to answer this question. So Brian, can you share your screen so I can ask the first question? Great, thank you. Audience members, I would love to know, what word comes to mind when you think about trauma? One word, please. Top of mind response. Go. Woo, that didn't take long. Pain, fear, hurting, violence, scared, injury, anxiety, devastation, violence, abuse, shame. Oh, these are really wonderful, very impactful. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds for the slide to populate. Wonderful. It looks like people have stopped sharing. So all of these words are absolutely accurate words when we think about the word trauma. And it definitely is on par with how we're going to be talking about trauma today. So give me just another second to move. So for our purposes today, we are going to be defining trauma the way the American Psychological Association defines trauma. And what the American Psychological Association tells us is that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. Gabor Mate, who's a retired physician who works with trauma survivors, reminds us in his writings that the word trauma is a Greek word for the word wound. And he goes on to tell us that trauma is a psychic wound that hardens a person psychologically and interferes with our ability to grow and develop. So while there's many good reasons for all of us to become trauma-informed as people in a society, probably the most compelling reason for this audience to become trauma-informed is that it's now regulatorily required by the CMS. So the CMS is requiring that skilled nursing facilities do the following, and I'll read the regulation for you. The facility must ensure that residents who are trauma survivors receive culturally competent, trauma-informed care in accordance with professional standards of practice, and accounting for a resident's experiences and preferences in order to eliminate or mitigate triggers that may cause re-traumatization of a resident. Now, that is a lot of words, and a lot of words that many of us can't even believe belong in the same sentence. And when I was the chief executive officer of the largest nursing home in Nebraska, this was my charge. I was supposed to be able to know what individuals in my community had experienced a traumatic event in their lifetimes so that I could care plan around those events in order to mitigate against a re-traumatization. And folks, I had no idea how to do that. I didn't know what trauma meant. I didn't know how to measure whether or not what I was doing was being effective. So with that curiosity, I had a call with 3 nurse consultants from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And they told me the reason why they implemented this particular regulation is that over 90% of the older adults that we care for in our nursing homes have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. They went on to tell me that death by suicide is the second highest rate of death in adults 85 years and older. To me, those were shocking statistics. So with that data and with that phone call, I began thinking about all of the people that I cared for on the front line of care and that were now under the roof of the assisted living or nursing home that I was managing. And I thought naturally of veterans of war and Holocaust survivors as being people who have likely experienced a traumatic event. But I thought to myself, what about everybody else? How am I supposed to know who has experienced trauma in their lifetime? And as luck would have it, when you work in senior living, many of you know this that are on the call, many of our best friends are people that are older adults. And one of my best friends in life is my next door neighbor, Helga. Helga's 90 right now, but when we first met, which was about 10 years ago when she was 80, we really developed a strong and trusting bond. But it wasn't until recently that she shared with me that she was a Holocaust survivor. She said to me, Jeannie, I don't have a tattoo on my arm, but I still have the scars. And that's when it dawned on me. That's when I started thinking to myself, that's it. That's what we need to do. We may never know what has happened in an older adult's life or the lives of the individuals that we work with. But if we take this appreciation of, I don't have a tattoo telling you what happened to me, but I still have the scars, if that's our orientation, then we can start looking at one another through a trauma-informed lens. So some of the situations that all of us can agree that are likely traumatic in our lives include such things as natural disasters, war and terrorism, accidents, medical procedures, bullying, abandonment, witnessing community violence, having been a person who has experienced child abuse or child sexual abuse, having neglect occur in our childhood, experiencing a life-threatening illness, experiencing a car accident, or loss of a caregiver. And this is going to be our second opportunity for everyone to pull out their phones and for Brian to share the Slido, because I want you all to think about and name an experience or an event that you consider traumatic in your personal or professional life. Wow. Divorce, death of my father, oh, death of a baby at 1 month old, loss of a child, cotton balls, COVID, bullying, trespassing in my house, rape, death of a father, watching my mother die from Alzheimer's, sexual abuse. It doesn't take us time or take us a lot of time to really identify the trauma that all of us have experienced. I'll keep going. Death of my brother, hearing things our residents experienced during Vietnam, death of a father, a miscarriage, parents died in a car accident, someone said in the chat, verbal abuse by my father. So what we're discovering here is that all of us have experienced some type of trauma, whether capital T or small t trauma in our lives. And this is a really impactful exercise. And I really appreciate all of you participating in it so fully and so honestly. So I'm going to ask Brian for you not to share your screen. I'm going to share my screen next. So, like I said, we've all experienced trauma in our lives in one shape or form. And again, know that it's coming from my heart that I say to all of you that typed in messages into that exercise, that I really appreciate you sharing, because it starts to help us all realize just how badly some of us are hurting from our past experiences. One of the things that I found so interesting about the CMS requirement when I talked to the nurse consultants is that they're requiring that skilled nursing facilities become trauma-informed for our residents, but they say nothing about us becoming trauma-informed for one another, for us in the care force. And as you can see, that 30-second exercise, we have a whole bevy of trauma that all of us are dealing with. So as I mentioned to you, my team at Children's Hospital and Medical Center, my social workers implemented what was known as the ACEs assessment. ACEs, again, stands for the Adverse Childhood Experience Assessment. And we're going to dig into that now just a little bit before I introduce these reports. So what my team was assessing for in our children and our families were 10 categories of childhood adversity that can occur in our patient's home. And what we would do in turn is build a psychosocial care plan around them that mitigated against the negative impact of trauma. The thought was at Children's was that the medical team, our excellent physicians and therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists and pharmacists could do all that they could on the medical side. But if we are discharging well children back to a sick environment, they're just going to be back in our hospital and our endeavors would be for naught. So earlier this year, this company called CARE, which is a senior technology company, really picked up the baton on helping our industry, our profession understand trauma. And what they did in collaboration with the National Association of Healthcare Assistants is they surveyed over 1,200 individuals in their care force to understand the impacts of ACEs on, first of all, to understand how prevalent ACEs is in the care force. Secondly, to see how ACEs and the COVID-19 pandemic influenced mental and physical health. And then part 3 of the survey and the report looked at social determinants of health. So how many individuals in our care force are struggling with food insecurity and housing instability and lack of transportation. And so all 3 of these reports are reports that CARE is producing. The first 2 are in publication right now. And at the end of this presentation, you'll have an opportunity to download a QR code where you can access the first 2 reports. The 3rd report will be out later this fall. So the basis for the CARE report revolved around the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And I want to take a little bit of time to explain what the Adverse Childhood Experience Study is, because I can guarantee you that once you learn about this, it is impossible for you to unlearn it and want to not want to know or want to know more about it. So in 1998, Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention tracked the health outcomes of more than 17,000 adults and found that those with poor health outcomes had experienced certain categories of childhood trauma. So those categories were child sexual abuse, child emotional abuse, child physical abuse, physical neglect and emotional neglect, having a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal person in the home, having a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member in the home, witnessing domestic violence, experiencing a loss of a family member through death or divorce, and finally, incarceration of a family member. So when we talk about the ACEs study, these are the 10 categories that my team at Children's assessed for and what the original ACEs study looked into or researched. And what the original ACEs study found is that there's a direct link between childhood trauma and the adult onset of chronic disease, as well as the adult onset of mental illness. They also found that those with a high prevalence of ACEs, those with a high score also kind of wound up socioeconomically towards the middle or the bottom of our socioeconomic rungs. And compared to individuals with 0 ACEs, people with 4 or more ACEs, and get a load of this, are 10 times more likely to use injectable drugs, 7 times more likely to be alcoholic, 3 times more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, 2 times more likely to be a current smoker, 30 times to attempt suicide, and for our purposes, 11 times more likely to develop and be diagnosed with a certain type of dementia. So it's small wonder that the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics has said that adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. This picture of an iceberg is a great way that I have chosen to illustrate what we know about someone is only that which is visible to the eye. So we can only discern what is happening with someone by what they tell us and what we observe ourselves. This is the behavior component, those things that we can notice and know about someone. But the behavior component, or pardon me, the trauma component is all that lies beneath the iceberg, beneath the surface. The things that we don't see right away and the things that we don't know have happened to a person unless they confide in us. And this is a really interesting and compelling way to think about your coworkers as well as the older adults that we serve in the nursing homes and assisted livings that we work in. So the ACEs study, the original ACEs study, that US population category, is the category that the ACEs study, the results of the original ACEs study. So in the first report, CARE found that compared to the original ACEs study, where 64% of the population had at least one ACE, in the CARE force, or those individuals that we work with, 73% have at least one ACE. When we look at the original ACE study in terms of how many people have 4 or more ACEs, the original study showed us that 17% of the population has 4 or more ACEs. In our CARE force, it's 34%, double of what the US population is. And I just want that to sink in for a moment and have you all really think about these statistics that lie in front of you. That double the population of individuals that we work with have an ACEs score of, 34% of them have an ACEs score of 4 or more. And what that means and why that's so important is moving into an area of educating all of you on this notion of toxic stress. You see, if you are a person who has 0 ACEs, then you are at a very low risk for experiencing toxic stress. If you have 1 to 3 ACEs, you are in the category of having a moderate or medium risk of toxic stress. But if you are in the 4 or more category, which is many of us in senior living, you are at a high risk for toxic stress. And what having a toxic stress or a high level of toxic stress in us means is that it can cause an overproduction of stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. High levels of cortisol, as we know, causes inflammation. It weakens our immune system and puts us at an increase for physical illness. Also, in high toxic stress levels, when you have that type of stress in your life, you are on high alert all of the time. What that means is that what is known as the stress response activation is always occurring in your physical environment, meaning you are constantly scanning the environment for danger. And the reason for that is that we as animals are biologically wired to scan the environment for danger so that we can either fight that danger, fly from that danger, or freeze from that danger. But when you are in a toxic stress level all of the time, even the smallest things in your environment can trigger that stress response. I like to explain this in the way that I heard Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris discuss it as the first Surgeon General of California. In her famous TED Talk, she asks us to imagine that you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. What happens is your hypothalamus sends a message to your pituitary glands, which sends a message to your adrenal glands to release hormone now. What happens is that adrenaline and cortisol start coursing through your veins, your eyes dilate really wide, your heart starts pounding, and your muscles get ready to either fight that bear or fly from that bear. And that is great if you are in a forest and you happen upon a bear. But this stress response activation becomes a real problem when people experience adversity over and over again, day after day, or when after the traumatic event happens and something triggers them, causing the cycle to repeat. The system that we know as being adaptive and life-saving moves to being maladaptive and health damaging. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, describes it best when he says that being traumatized is not just an issue of being stuck in the past. It's just as much of a problem of not being alive in the present. He goes on to say that trauma is much more than a story we tell ourselves about something that happened long ago. The emotions and the physical sensations that were imprinted during the trauma are experienced not as memories, but as real-time destructive physical events that we are reacting to in the present. So I want to pause a little bit here and kind of move to a different area of trauma, which is talking about the social impact of trauma. Traumatic events like 9/11 or maybe the disasters of the hurricane that we're experiencing right now in North Carolina are traumatic events that we all have shared in community, meaning we rally behind these traumatic events. We start helping our neighbors who are out of food and water and shelter and bring them into our own homes. After 9/11, probably every household in America bought a new American flag. But when it comes to trauma that we experience individually, there's something really dynamic that happens. We tend to keep our traumatic experiences that we experience as individuals quiet, and that goes back to that untold story component. Human beings are primates. And we are social animals, and we are made to get along in the systems that may have created our trauma in the first place. And our very survival depends on acquiescing what we truly feel in order to maintain in a society and in our group. And the best thing I can think about is all of those questions or all of those answers you provided to the question of what trauma you have experienced. Imagine going into the workplace and start talking about those traumatic events. We know that sometimes that is probably the most difficult conversations we can have, and we are wired not to have them so that we can maintain in a group. When we keep these secrets inside, people start feeling that they themselves are defective, and they have a deep sense of that feeling of being defective. To the extreme, people believe that they're making those things up that happened to them, or at the very worst, believe that the events that have happened to them are their own fault. So I'm going to stop sharing again because it's Brian's turn to help us answer this following question. Write one word that describes how you think trauma shapes a person. Aha, resilience. Bitter, yeah. Tough, fear, growth, growth, growth. Growth is growing. Closed off to others, broken, isolated, distrusting, reserved, standoffish, hate, hardens, anger, social anxiety, fear, depressed, depression, untrusting. Yeah, all of that. All of that and more. This is exactly how trauma shapes a person. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Thank you, Brian. I think that's the final one before the poll. So moving on to what I want to discuss next is really looking at the second report that CARE published within the last couple of weeks. As I mentioned in this discussion, CARE wanted to not only understand the prevalence and impact of ACEs, but they wanted to go a little bit deeper to ask those who completed the survey, how has ACEs impacted your physical and mental health? And what they found is that 1 in 4 individuals in the care force report that their ACEs score has negatively impacted their current physical health. And that 2 in 4 in the care force report that their ACEs score negatively affected their mental health impact. So again, this demonstrates to us that all of those childhood adversities that we think happened long ago, now as adults are still really affecting us both physically and mentally. In the second report, CARE also wanted to understand what the COVID-19 impact was on our physical and mental health. And what they found is that whether you are in a high risk tolerance, in the high category of having toxic stress, or the low level or the low category of toxic stress, half of the care force have indicated that the COVID-19 has impacted their mental and physical health. So with this, I'm curious, as you all go back to your communities and you ponder this data, I'm wondering if you're starting to see things within your community, like an increase in sick days or an increase in injuries and accidents among your coworkers, or if you're seeing an increase in documentation errors. I think that that type of data that we collect all day long in senior living communities can really tell a story about how COVID-19 and our past ACEs experiences really have shaped us, and how they help us, or what they're doing to cloud our thinking as we are attempting to perform these critical tasks. So the next round, to really demonstrate how the COVID-19 pandemic may have impacted you, is I have 4 true or false questions. So I am going to stop sharing so Brian can do his magic, and I'll read the questions as soon as he has the poll brought up. Okay, so yes or no, true or false, my organization has processed through or continues to talk about the traumatic events we experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic as a means of healing. Okay, more people. Okay, I see. I didn't know it was dynamic. That's cool. Give it a little minute to populate.
And also in the chat, people are also answering in the chat. I don't know if you're checking the chat as well. But there's a lot of answers there as well.
I see that. I see a toggle between no's and yeses, Charles. Thank you for alerting that. That's true. So I didn't catch. Okay, so the final results are yes, or pardon me, no. 63% are saying no, that the organization has not talked about the traumatic events we experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, where 34% say they have. So the next question, if we move to that, things are back to normal in my senior living community since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of no's in the chat, almost resoundingly. So I would say we're probably at 75-25 or 74-26, that no, things have not gone back to normal. Next question. I feel differently about my job in senior living since the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes. Okay. I'm going to leave it there at 86-14, that 86% do feel differently. It's gone up to 89, while between 14 and 16% do not. The final question. I experienced the COVID-19 pandemic as a traumatic event. Overwhelming majority. In the interest of time, I think I'll leave it there at 85-15. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that. I think that was a really telling exercise. So with all of the activities we've done today, whether it is opening up about what you've experienced in a personal and professional life as a traumatic event, or how you view COVID, whether your organization has processed through it, or if it's changed the way that you think about your job in senior living, what we're doing here is we're shifting the narrative. And trauma-informed care really moves us away from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And a trauma-informed care approach acknowledges that senior living organization and care teams need to have a complete picture of both residents and employees' entire life situations in order to provide exceptional services, or services that have a healing orientation. What I often talk about to leaders when they're willing to engage on this sensitive topic is I'm really encouraging organizations to embrace compassion as a strategic initiative. And I think sometimes, even though we're in a caring profession, when it comes to our own team members, that's a little bit more of a difficult leap to take. And I remind the leaders that I talk to is, hey, I'm not asking all of you to become therapists, but what I am suggesting is that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And so I'm going to move on to maybe the most important topic of the talk today, which is really touching on the resilience that we have among the care force. One person or several person typed into the chat that one of the things that they think about when they think about trauma is someone's resilience. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, every time that I speak to a live audience, I have lots of people that come up to me after with this one simple question. Jean, what do? I have all 10 ACEs. And I typically say to them, congratulate yourself that you're still here. You clearly, individual with 10 ACEs, are doing something that's allowing you to show up in the world, and you really have to congratulate yourself for that. The second thing I ask them to do is to look at the way that they have coped with those things that have caused them trauma, and ask themselves, are those coping mechanisms things that are going to sustain me from a health and well-being standpoint? So for example, if an individual says, well, I usually smoke about a pack a day because that really alleviates my high toxic stress levels, and then I come home and I have about a half a bottle of wine, I ask that person, is that something you want to continue? Do you feel like those coping mechanisms are things that will be able to bring you into older adulthood? And if the answer is no, then the idea of what we do is start building a care plan around that individual that moves them away from those maladaptive behaviors into behaviors that can sustain them. For our purposes today, also, as I may have mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, is what this is about today is just raising awareness around trauma. I have a lot of individuals in the senior living community that want to know, how do we help our customers and our employees who grew up in an era where spare the rod, whether in an era where if you spared the rod, you spoiled the child, and where it was impolite to talk about family secrets. And I've taken a good long look at that conundrum. And what I have come up with is that, again, I think the way that we look at individuals in senior living might be a little misguided and really needs a little bit of tweaking. And again, it goes back to looking at those maladaptive behaviors. We know that when we move individuals into senior living communities, we're basically cutting them off from the freezer full of Haagen-Dazs or the animal that they've had for the last 20 years in their lives that can't move into the senior living community. And they move in with us and are able to go along and get along for so long. But then over time, those coping mechanisms that they have acquired over time are really needed, and they don't have access to them. So then we start documenting those behaviors that we're seeing in our residents. And a lot of times what happens, instead of understanding why those behaviors are happening, we call the doctor and get a medication prescribed to them so that those behaviors are reduced. Or if the behavior is really something we can't manage, sometimes we move to discharge them. So my overall approach to this, whether it's a resident or employee that comes into your office and they're just not the same person you admitted to the nursing home or assisted living, or the person that you hired, that you really have this awareness of what could be happening in their personal lives currently and in the past that's causing them to react this way. From a community services and programs standpoint, I really like this idea of taking a case management approach to our employees like we do our residents. So can we look at what's happening in their lives, whether they're food insecure or they lack reliable transportation or they have unstable housing? Can we build a social care plan around them so that we can hook them up with access to those types of services? From the mental health and EAP standpoint, and EAP is employee assistance programs, could we do a better job in our communities of leveraging employee health? So it just, in addition to the flu shots and the tuberculosis shots we receive from employee health, could they also be screening for social determinants of health and screening for depression and screening for ACEs in a very confidential manner, so that we know what we're dealing with in terms of the struggles that our employees are experiencing? And finally, when I talk about positive workplace well-being, what I'm really encouraging leaders to do is move beyond the water bottle and pedometer approach to wellness, and instead having these types of conversations about mental health and trauma and how the COVID-19 impact forever changed our profession, and maybe in some situations forever changed you personally, and really get real and honest about the challenges that we all still experience as a result of the pandemic. I tell leaders all the time that we are now managing a new generation of caregivers who invented the emoji, who want to emote about what they're feeling and what to do about it. You know, if they put a thumbs up after a text message or a frowny face after a text message, these are individuals that really want to share what's on their mind and what's in their hearts. Some of the things that I do with communities when I'm working with them is I do a series of exercises that I want to share with you, because I think you can modify these exercises for your organization. And the first one I do, this is particularly with nurses. So you notice that picture on the screen. When I found this picture, it really reminded me of me and my CNAs back in the day during a jeans day on the smoking patio during our break. And so it just really engenders kind of a really happy memory for me of thinking about me and my other CNAs when we used to smoke on the patio. But the nature of this exercise is demonstrating to people that we heal in community, that it's okay to talk about our past adversity, And so when I give talks live and in person, on everybody's table is a sheet of paper that says, I am a person who. And then individuals are invited to share with everybody the adversity they experienced. All of those papers are collected and they come to the top of the room or the front of the room to me, and I start reading them in threes. So I'll hear things like, I'm a person who could save everybody else's parent, but couldn't save my own parent during COVID. I'm a person who suffers from PTSD from a war that I fought in. I'm a person who survived sexual assault. And I read those 3 by 3 and say, okay, room, can everybody stand by these people? And unanimously, the room just explodes with people standing up. They sit down, I read 3 more, and so on and so forth. And it's a very powerful exercise to demonstrate, first of all, that healing happens in community. And second of all, it could be the very first time that people in their own privacy, in their own moment and confidentially have talked about or written about the adversity that has happened to them. The next thing I love to do is to give individuals writing prompts. And one of the writing prompts that I love is just a simple exercise where you answer the question, what is it like to be you? So instead of asking, tell me about yourself, or write 10 characteristics that describe you, or give me all the titles that you have had, whether it's mom, sister, grandmother, etc. What this really does is it cuts through all the baloney. And it really is a question that triggers a lot of thought in an individual. And individuals are prompted to write for 15 minutes straight without lifting their pen or pencil off the paper. And what that does is it really gets them out of their mind and into their body and in touch with the emotions that they have been feeling about their true and authentic selves. So Dr. Sandra Bloom is a board-certified psychiatrist who works to create trauma-aware workplaces. And she says it best when she says that trauma-aware workplaces offer a safety and support, a place where people can bring their whole selves and be valued for who they are. You know, when I first read this quote, I literally was transferred back to 1989, when at the age of 19, I started on the front line of care in a skilled nursing facility. What my nurse manager saw in me, that it was this young, energetic, smart, hardworking individual that poured her heart and soul into older adults by picking up extra shifts and working doubles. My nurse manager wasn't wrong. I was all of those things on the outside. But on the inside, it was a completely different picture. I was hiding a traumatic event that happened in my life just a year before, and I numbed my trauma with workaholism and people pleasing, and like I said, pouring everything that I had into older adults. Many employees in senior care are doing the same thing that I did, but for different reasons. Senior care team members are extremely good at hiding their pain because they're masters at being able to live a double life. So, Brian, I guess I have one more slide that requires your help. So one more slide for the audience where I need you to participate in the following question.
Ryan,
We're having a little technical difficulty on my end.
Thanks, Brian.
I'll cue up the audience. Here's the question. Write one word that describes how this information will help you move through your life and work differently.
Yeah, we can have it in the chat as well.
I see mindfulness, freedom, perspective, awareness, compassion, helpful pause, tolerance. peaceful, compassion, pause. I love that word, pause. Empowered, compassion again, awareness. And it's okay, Brian. I think we're getting really great feedback through just the chat itself. So I'm going to go
Great.
back to sharing my screen just to make sure that I'm on time and I honor everyone's time on the call. I promised people that I would share with them the QR code for the 2 reports that CARE did. So if people have their phones out, this is the first report that dives into adverse childhood experiences in the care force. Then QR code number 2 will take you to signing up for the influence of mental health and personal well-being in the workplace. Leave that up for a couple seconds. And Charles, I know these slides will be available for people, so this isn't kind of the only time that they would have access to download it. In conclusion, I also want to tell you a little bit about my company, Radical Sabbatical. I started Radical Sabbatical for this reason, and this reason only, is because I know there's a huge amount of us in senior living that really struggle with past and current trauma. And my interest is to help individuals and organizations turn adversity into advocacy. So I invite all of you to visit my website, which is www.radicalsabbaticalcare.com. And I would love it, and I invite you to sign up for a QR or a discount code to my trauma healing workbook, which is pictured there on the right. The trauma healing workbook is a workbook that takes you from the research that I talked a lot about to the me search. And if you sign up and contact me, I'm going to issue you a discount, a 20% discount on this exhaustive and beautiful workbook that I created during the winter time. And with that, Charles, I think we have a couple minutes to wrap up and hear from you.
Yeah, Jean, that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, obviously personal stories, but also your professional journey. It makes obviously your content, which is, you know, from a deep expertise level, but even more meaningful, especially given the audience. You know, what I particularly like was the recommendation you had to consider care planning for ourselves. And I mean, I don't know for the whole audience, but for me, definitely, I like the concept for sure. Thank you.
We forget about ourselves a lot while
Yes,
for
we're
others.
very good at that. We're very good at it. Thank you, Jean, so much. Everyone, I've already put it twice in the chat, but one thing that I also would love you to consider is maybe follow Jean on LinkedIn. Very predominant figure that has been speaking at national events, and at the least just give her a follow and continue the learning. Thank you so much, Jean. I'll just share my screen for a couple announcements regarding future events. And so just as a quick heads up, on October 15th, we have our next webinar. This is a quarterly series that we've re-enabled, which I find pretty cool, and always we get amazing feedback, is when we bring what we call resident engagement champions, which are people like you, most of the audience, which are, you know, activity life enrichment directors doing the work. And we bring them in to share what's going on, what the challenges, and some of the great things that they're doing. So please join us on October 15th for this one. And then we have listed all of our upcoming events, and they are available on activitystrong.com. So these are the calendar events that we have almost until the end of the year. I want to highlight the one I just mentioned here from Resident Engagement Champion. We've had a lot of requests to talk about sex and senior living. So we have one on November 5th on the topic. and a few more coming up, as you can see. So we're very excited for our lineup. If you have any kind of ask, requests, as always, we love to hear them. This is often how we build better programming. And with that, we'll love to wish you all a great afternoon, great end of day, or early afternoon, depending on where you are. Jean, I can't wait to see you again soon, I hope. And
Yes.
I want to thank you again for joining us. This was really, really good.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take care, Jean. Bye-bye.